Hello and welcome to SUSU Elections Debate 2013 with me, your host, James Binns. With me today are your VP DCI candidates, Democracy and Creative Industries. Guys, would you like to introduce yourselves?
I'm David Martin.
I'm John North.
Okay, so over the next 30 minutes, these guys are going to be battling it out so that you at home can decide who is best to be your next VP DCI. Phew, that's quite a mouthful. Okay, so let's go over to you first, John. What are your key points in this election?
My 4 key points for this election are going to be transparency, equality, accountability and support. So in more detail, transparency is that everyone should see exactly what's going on in SUSU, and it should be easily accessible to anyone who wants to know how these decisions are being made and what decisions are being made, as opposed to the current system where it can be very hard to find this sort of information even on the SUSU website. Equality, I want to get as many people involved as possible. So if you look at my manifesto, I've got specific sections on international students and freshers, which are our sort of biggest demographics which aren't currently involved, particularly in SUSU. I was chatting to some Chinese students a few days ago and they said they'd never heard of SUSU, which, you know, says a lot in itself. But they also said that they want to get more involved, they just didn't really know how. Accountability is another one of my main points. Obviously, there's been a lot of controversy with some of the actions of the SABs in the last year, one way or another, and I think students should be able to take the SABs and hold them to account. And their student leaders, you know, not just the SABs, everyone at any level of SUSU should have to answer for any policies they make and they enact. And if someone disagrees with it, they should be able to go up to them and say, I don't like this policy, you know, why did you implement this? And they should be able to, you know, give us an answer for that, and they should be, well, they should have to give an answer. My final key point is support, and this is literally the creative industry side of it. So support for the performing arts, support for the SUSU media across all the aspects. We've got some, you know, amazing organisations here in Southampton University, and I think that continual support for all of these is an absolute necessity. And again, on my manifesto, I've got a section on every specific area, which you can then look at, you know, to see what you're particularly interested in.
Excellent. Okay, thanks, John. David?
My 4 key points involve empowering student representatives, because obviously the societies have been reorganised this year, and it's imperative that we are able to trace, every student is able to trace a route up to their student leaders, up through their sabbaticals, and that all our society representatives who have now been moved into different areas are now able to actually make real change, feel that they're empowered, and I think that's really key. I'm going to make sure we've got creative content focused as well. This involves sort of making sure that Union Films and media are all at sites as well. So in terms of broadcasting, we get that out there, we get publicity out there, and we distribute around halls and sites, because that's where a lot of our students live and work, and they unfortunately don't have the access they should have. I'm really passionate about unlocking our budgets, because I've spoken to many student groups who are just bewildered by how budgets work in this union. They are really confused by how allocations work for different groups, how the variety works, and I think it's important that we have accessible, just clear, standard budgets for everyone to look at, and also treasurer training so that everyone knows how they can improve these areas. And finally, I want to work towards a sort of a spaces strategy for the creative industries. All of them are underrepresented in terms of spaces. They're quite outdated, they're quite small, and I think it's vital that we work towards at least a 5-year vision, which is carried on from SAB to SAB, because it's mentioned in a lot of manifestos over the years that sabbaticals want to improve performing arts or the spaces for them, and it's just really not a realistic vision, and I want to make sure that we actually put this down on paper and can actually work through a vision for 5 years so that it works effectively.
Excellent, thank you for that, guys. Picking up on something you both said then, we'll go on to our first question. Do you think that students should have to pay for society membership? David, I'll come to you first.
Do you mean all student groups?
Yeah.
I think that all student groups, I think they should. It kind of depends. It's very much on the society, what they feel is right for them. There are a lot of aspects to get funding. You can get funding, obviously, from the union. You can do fundraising. But I think some aspect of it does have to come from an individual who feels it is right. They've got to pay some contribution to what they're going to do. I mean, there's a lot of equipment that you need. Sometimes there's trips, there's transport, and that kind of stuff. I think it is right that, yes, they do pay for some.
How much is enough?
You can't really say how much it is, because it really does depend on what you're doing. I mean, if you've got someone like Photosoc, for instance, who have to buy cameras and that sort of thing, it's completely different to a group that just goes on socials. Like I'll use the alternative. Well, I won't use them as it is a bad idea, but it really does depend on sort of what you're actually aiming to do, what are your aims of the society, and kind of how that's going to work.
So would you be willing to pay for cameras and things like that for Camera Society, for example, or
would I be willing?
If you were in this role?
In terms of allocation, I
Yeah,
think that
in terms of allocation.
Photosoc have a problem in getting like allocations for their budgets, and I think it's kind of an issue that the Photosoc, I'm going to use them as a specific example. They have issues of, the fact is that buying a camera for them would cost like 1/3 of the society's budget, and I think it's something that it needs to be looked at much better in terms of how we support them and how we work to do that, because obviously they're kind of on par with media departments in terms of their equipment. So I think a discussion needs to be had on whether they should be involved in the media departments.
Okay, John, what do you think? Do you think that students should have to pay for society membership?
Again, I think it really depends on the society. Although I'm generally of the opinion that the membership itself shouldn't be paid for, but specific aspects of being in that society should be paid for. For example, you shouldn't have to pay to be a member of Photosoc. If you're taking Photosoc as an example of this, but if you wanted to, do a lot more with them, then you should be asked to, put something back into it. But
what do you describe as sort of the level of engagement in that? When do they stop becoming a member, and when do they become more involved?
That surely that's more of a question for the people who actually run that specific society to decide.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I suppose, but you'd have to have different levels of membership within a society itself.
Oh, no. What I'm saying is that although membership for any specific society should be at base either free or very cheap, the further you get involved in the society, the more you should have to put something back into it. So stuff like events, you should be paying for events rather than for membership of society. I mean, a lot of the stuff I'm involved in, not much of our budget comes from membership at all.
Where does it come from?
But then you also come from shows.
From SUSU, from various fundraising events. It's just, there are various avenues of raising revenue, and in a lot of cases, membership fees aren't the biggest aspect of that. Although obviously in other cases they are. So what I would say is, it really does need to be on a society-by-society basis, and it's really a decision for those specific committees. I don't think SUSU should be putting down rules as to whether people should be charging or not charging.
I agree with John that it kind of depends on what the society wants to achieve, and there are a lot of different methods, and I think it's important as DCI we sort of put forward that you don't just go to SUSU for funding, that we offer opportunities for them to do other things, sort of teaching them how to fundraise and teaching them how to make more out of their membership and how they can have perhaps different levels. And I think that is one of the reasons why the DCI was moved to look over those sort of things, to have some sort of centralised system where we can look at how student groups get their support, get their funding, and how they can do it in different ways.
Okay, so both of you have said that you believe that societies shouldn't have to charge membership if they don't want to. You've both said that societies should look for different budget ways of raising their funds. So where do you differ? What's the difference between you then? Why not? Why should I vote for either of you if you're both saying the same thing?
I think that's common sense there, James. I mean, it's really got to be dependent on what the societies want to do. I know that a lot of societies do have issues with sort of budget affiliation. I think that's the main thing, is budget allocation issues on how they actually go about getting them. And I think a lot of the time, too many people do think that they're just entitled to SUSU funding. And I think it's right that they are entitled
I think that's a good point, yeah.
Entitled to SUSU funding, but I think it's kind of a common sense approach that every society is different. We have 200, we have over 200 of them, and I don't think there's a difference. I don't think me or John disagree on the fact that it's got to be different.
Yeah,
obviously,
you can't have a one glove fits all approach to this.
Yeah.
There's such a huge variety. Even within the sort of sub areas, so you've got the media departments, the performing arts departments, you've got the sports departments. Even within those sort of sub societal groups, that's not a word, is it? But even with those subgroups within the societies, you're going to have completely different necessities within the budget. So if you look at Stage Stock, they have to buy a huge amount of high-end equipment. Whereas if you look at something like Theatre Group, most of our costs are a lot smaller to do workshops and things.
Okay, so you're both offering a flexible approach there. Okay, I can appreciate that. Moving on, which area of this new role do you think, and if you were elected, needs most work? I'll come to you first, John.
I think communication between different societies is
between the SAB and different societies, or
both between. I think just communication as a general rule, communication both between the SABs and the societies alongside them, and between.
But John, communications doesn't actually fall under the remit of DCI anymore. That's under engagement.
Please.
But they are
finished.
Well, okay.
It's about communication. I haven't finished what I'm saying. I wasn't talking about that. I'm referring to communication between societies being an issue.
Or collaboration.
Collaboration. When societies are doing events together, when you've got all these big events, their communication is a huge issue between the different people, the different aspects. So if you've got 4 or 5 different branches of the media department and they're not talking to each other and they don't know who they need to be going to, then you're going to get issues.
So what's your role within that then?
The way I would see this role would be someone just literally there coordinating everyone, making sure that they know there's someone that people can go and speak to and just find out what's meant to be going on, or if it's outside of my ability level, I'd be able to know who to say. I'd be able to know who to point them towards to sort it out.
If they're not communicating between themselves, though, what makes you think they're going to communicate with you?
It's more of obviously it's a work in progress. It's more of the sort of making sure that everyone knows that there is someone just there at the core that
I would argue that student leaders are already in that position. You've got things like Performing Arts Officer that looks over the 13 performing arts societies and helps coordinate them with the music rep, the theatre rep and the dance rep.
Exactly.
So I would argue that that's actually not necessarily.
So what would you focus on?
I would focus on student groups, because I think now that they've come together, and then one of the main reasons of putting student groups under the democracy zone in the first place is because there's been this sort of hodgepodge method of sort of allocating funding and budgets and affiliations that really are confusing to a lot of student groups, and student groups are, disenfranchised by it. And I really want to focus on student groups, and two main areas, as I mentioned in my key points, is empowerment of our representatives. So obviously they're split up into about 10 or 11, I can't remember the number off my top of my head, 10 or 11 different representatives at the moment, and they focus on things like the political societies and the music, arts and media societies. And now they're spread up into a load of different zones. I think it's more important than ever before that these people feel that they've actually got a voice when they sit on those places to make change. They work with the students group officer who sits under the vice president.
How do you make them feel they've got a voice?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's cool. You've actually got to give them some physical power to actually do things on these committees, give them a vote, make sure they're informed about what they can actually do. A lot of student reps sort of sit there, and when you say student reps, they don't actually represent them, and presidents of certain societies feel that they...
Again, that's all communication stuff. That's all lack of communication of where these issues are.
Well, this is just one point of my student groups bit. I mean, there are many aspects as to why I think student groups are the most important. That's just one point of it, is empowering the representatives to feel they can make change. I mean, at the moment, they're just reps from society's committee. They don't really go from it. And the second point is kind of talking about budgets specifically in affiliations, because there's sort of people don't really understand sort of how affiliations kind of work with a lot of the societies, and they struggle with sort of the funding throughout the year. And it has improved a little bit. They've got more funding, but they're not sure how to access it. And even in groups sort of media, when we want to do something different, when we want to sort of maybe do a competition, for instance, it really is hard for you to actually get that money that you want and bring it back down to where you need to put it, which I think is just wrong. I mean, we're a £7 million turnover at this union, and for the students themselves not to know how to use budgets, and many of them have come to me when I've been speaking to students and saying, actually, I'm really unsure on how these budgets actually work. What are we actually trying to achieve?
I appreciate what you're saying there, and I would actually agree with that. But you talk about making it easier. How are you going to actually do it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I want to do is they have budget. When you get budget, you have a sort of a weird template that you get, and the templates it's very difficult for the normal person to understand. And one of the things I want to do is have treasurer training with finance people from SUSU to make sure that we've actually got the opportunity for treasurers to know and how to interpret their budgets, and make sure we've got finance officers on committees as well, so that there is someone there.
Certainly within the PA there already is treasurer training.
Yeah, I'm sure there is.
It has been for the last few years. It might have been last year it came.
But that's one of the things I think is an issue, the fact that it's very differential between a lot of different groups. Some groups have it, some groups don't have it, and I think that's completely out of line considering some groups are able to spend their money more. And I think one of the other problems is how budgets are allocated, and just to make sure that, because some groups like to make generic statements like, oh, sports get more than media or something like that, and there's no actual place you can go to and say this is what the budget for each group is, without going through trawls of bureaucracy. And I think that's something that really needs to improve in openness and transparency.
So your main point there would be you want to look at budgets and cut
One
through
of my main groups
you want to cut through bureaucracy in regards to budgets then?
Well, no, that's not the main point of everything at all. It's student groups, and one of the bits, there's a lot of different aspects to student groups, which is why I want to focus. The main areas of this role are creative industries, democracy, and affiliations and budgets of student groups. Obviously, communications is a massive area, and it involves a lot of different things. You've got to communicate all the time to be effective. And the one I would focus on is student groups. Not democracy, because I think David Goline's done a lot of great work with democracy this year, and I think that while it does need to be improved on, and there's a loss of faith in some of our processes, there's a lot that we can build on that's already in place. And I think creative industries is an area that, again, will need some work and collaboration. It's an exciting new area to go into, but student groups, I think, is the one where we look at the processes of it all and how it all works and really needs some improvement.
I want to come back to your point about communication, actually. I think that's a good point, but surely that's not going to be the bulk of your role.
No, I just think it's a specific aspect right now which needs a lot of work. You said what area do you think most needs more work? That was the first thing that came to mind.
Okay.
If you want to look at, what larger area, assuming that's what you're asking, needs a lot more work, I would have to say it is involvement. Because if we
involvement of who? Students?
Involvement of students, because SUSU as a organisation is huge.
So involvement of students into SUSU?
In SUSU, in the societies, in every aspect of it. So we've got hundreds, thousands of students in the university. What's 20,000, 20-something thousand.
20,000.
And we had, 7,000 people voting in the last election? And
that's actually quite high.
That is quite high.
Compared to most student unions.
It was one of the highest
I know it's high, but that's still 14,000 people, 15,000 people who aren't voting and who aren't engaged. So there's still a lot of growth for potential there.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is always something that's brought up every year.
Specifically, it's looking at getting them involved in societies, involved in what they want to be doing, because it's just. I guess it comes back to lack of communication, but a different type of communication. Rather than into society, it's more making sure that people know exactly what there is in university and what they can access, what resources they're eligible for and have access to.
Mentioning your point about the sort of student elections and the members voting, brings us on to another question. Would you guys rather have sort of 10,000 uninformed voters who just sort of vote because they like your poster, or would you rather have 1,000 informed voters who know the policies, who know the reasons why they are voting as they are? You first?
I'd absolutely go for 1,000 voters who know what they're voting for. I'm
Okay.
running my campaign on just making sure that everything is, I'm doing it so that people know that it's an actual policy-based campaign that I'm going for. I want to have a nice clean-cut campaign. I want to make sure that voters know what they expect from me. I'm honest, I'm open, I'm innovative. I don't sort of make things up. I think that one of the things that people have been really concerned about recently is a lack of faith in sabbaticals. And that was something I want to reverse back to something with experience, and that's what I want to do. So I want to have 1,000 informed voters. Obviously, I'd rather have 10,000 informed voters, but obviously you can't have that, and I think it's something to improve on.
How would you improve on that, on trying to get those numbers up?
That's an interesting question. I think one of the things is sort of comes into my democracy vein of sort of using union council and broadening that out.
Do most students engage with union
No,
council?
I think that's one of the things. I want to broaden it out away from just union council, because union council is a 3-hour-long meeting, and I can imagine that plenty of people don't want to go onto that.
I don't even go to that. So.
And I want to make sure that we have union councillors, and they're meant to represent students, but a lot of the time I found that union councillors represent their own views instead of students.
Yeah, absolutely.
They don't actively go out and talk to what students
So would you say it's an accountability error in that? So the problem there is with being able to hold those student councillors to accountability.
Well, student councillors are themselves meant to hold sabbaticals to account. So if there's a whole break in the accountability chain, then it's obviously a bit of an issue to talk about there. So
but bringing it back onto how you raise the numbers up of informed voters.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has always been an issue is understanding the elections and what an election means to you. I mean, when you talk to students, a lot of them will find that the only time they actually get engaged is when there is an election. But before that, they haven't actually done it before. So they get bombarded with all this election stuff and are just assumed to know what's meant to be going on. But unfortunately, that hasn't actually been the case sometimes. And I think it's important that you go through sort of an aspect of, in an individual kind of way, go through like a 24 aspect of someone's life and kind of what areas do they think, that are they actually involving in SUSU where they may not realise it? Because a lot of people sort of assume, oh, SUSU means nothing to me, but actually they don't realise that things like housing, things like nightlife, things like working with their JCRs are actually part of SUSU, and that's a major issue, and it's something I want to improve on, making sure that actually is relevant to you.
So you think by engaging with students, by letting them know what SUSU is about, they'll become informed?
That's not specifically the role of the DCI, it's the role of engagement, but yeah, I think it's just sort of making it clear those processes, like, well, this is actually what we do, and this is actually how you go about changing it, which goes back to the part about empowering student representatives and that aspect of it. And I think it's more important of understanding the processes of what actually goes on in a sort of, not in a sort of formal and highly descriptive way, because that does tend to put people off. Not everyone is involved in deep union politics, and I think that's not something we should be expecting. So away from union council, having more broader idea sessions and discussions that may involve debate.
John? What do you think? 10,000 uninformed or 1,000 informed?
Well, are you asking me as someone who's running in an election, or are you asking me as someone... Well,
wouldn't it just be you anyway? I mean,
well, no.
you are you. Are you trying to be someone else
well,
in the
you said
election?
Two different people. You got two
my
different-
answer's very different here, honestly. Well, very much the same. I'd rather have 10,000 people voting, but I'd much rather they were all informed.
No, that's
not a question. You can't just
that's
pick
a very
and
good
choose.
politician's answer.
Well, there you go. But no. Obviously, it'll be 1,000 informed voters. I spent a lot of time on my policies, spent a lot of time working on the manifesto, and I'd much prefer people actually read them before voting for me. I think...
Not necessarily, I mean,
Well,
this is not necessarily about people voting for you. This is,
No.
say neither of you were standing, would you rather, because one day you won't
I would
be
still
here.
rather.
Oh yeah, I'd still rather have
have
1,000 people who are informed and know what's going on, because if you've got 10,000 people just voting for whoever's got the, as you said earlier, the prettiest poster or the most entertaining flash mob, then there's something going wrong here. You could have someone who is completely unqualified for the role and would do a terrible job, but they could be an absolute master at politics and marketing and just sweep that kind of election, which would be a disaster for SUSU as a whole in the long term.
You can't have people who are good at. A lot of people are good at marketing and have a lot of friends, and that doesn't necessarily make them a good role, a good fit for the role, and especially in certain positions which involve democracy and creative industries. Democracy is something that obviously you need a bit of experience in to sort of make work well, and I think it's crucial to have those informed voters who understand what you're going to be standing for and what you're going to be fighting for.
And ideally, I'd have 1,000 informed voters the first year, and then ideally, 1,500 the next year, 2,000.
So how would you build it up? Because we've heard
How would I build it up?
what Dave's got to say, but
I would focus on the groups who are, say, marginalised within SUSU. That's not really the word I mean. The people who don't feel they are represented. Like international students, like people at the Winchester campus, people in NOC, people at Avenue, people who aren't in this sort of core group at Highfield where a lot of the stuff gets done. I mean, the vast bulk of people on all of these councils and all of these positions are from the Highfield campus or from those sort of areas. And I think, we're missing out on a huge part of our student body who could be more involved in that regard. That would be the first sort of area I'd target. And, increasing from there, it would again be just almost getting people involved early, because I find if you speak to people in the first few weeks, they're likely to, I say habits for university form early on. So if someone starts getting involved in society and things early on in the university, they're likely to be continually involved.
I think that's a fair point.
When you say involved, it's a nice word to say that you want people involved, but what do you think that actually entails?
Participation in societies, participation in a democracy in the union, and general, making sure their voice is heard. So
ensuring that all year round, and that will hopefully mean they'll inform
they
voters.
Get more because I think the people who are most informed about SUSU are the people who care the most about SUSU, and the people who care the most are the people who are affected the most by it.
I wouldn't always say that. I think that when you get involved, obviously you get involved because you care about it. I think that's crucially important. That's why SUSU is run by so many volunteers who are really good, and I think that it's kind of.
You're saying that are you going to say that the people who care the most about SUSU are likely to be less informed?
No, not at all. I mean, I think the people who everyone to some extent, without realising it, cares about SUSU, and I think one of the major things is that message that actually they do care about SUSU, and here's why you care about SUSU, without actually realising these aspects that take place in the union. I think that's critical.
I think that's a good point. Both of you talked about accountability and representation, that sort of thing. I mean, what do you think that your role should be? I mean, should it be editor-in-chief of the media, or should you be there simply to support the media? John?
I absolutely believe that the role of DCI should not be the editor-in-chief of media.
Okay, why?
Because we have people for that role who know it a lot better than I do, for example, or than he would do. So if I was in taking on this role, I don't want to then become the editor of the Wessex Scene, because there are so many people who are far more qualified for that specifically.
There's a good distinction between editor and editor-in-chief. I'm not sure if you've realised the distinction between editor and editor-in-chief, or Director-General of the Surge or
SUSUtv.
SUSUtv.
We have opposing views here, that's good, right. Go on.
Well, I think the role shouldn't have control over.
There's a legal part you have to play as SUSU to be editor-in-chief. You have to make sure that these things aren't slanderous, they're not libel.
Yes.
And so you're just going to say that's the editor's role as a student leader who's a volunteer role.
We're all adults. We shouldn't be writing slander and libel in our newspapers anyway. If something comes out, then if someone is published in that publication that is slanderous or that is libelous, then it's the people involved and the people who wrote it should be taken into account. The people who have not should be taken to what's the word?
To be made account of.
To be made account of, that's what I completely...
That's right.
Well,
So, David, you saying that you
there.
would therefore take a more hands-on approach?
I wouldn't take a hands-on approach. No. As editor-in-chief this year, I've worked with David Jelani, and he just reads through the magazine and he makes sure that there are things in there is up to scratch. I mean,
yeah, of course you do that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, that's kind of what the editor-in-chief role is. I mean, it really is up to the individual himself how kind of hands-on you want to be. I would not censure any media department by any means. I think it's up to them what they write, and I think SUSU Media does need to be more critical of SUSU, or allowed to be more critical at SUSU at times, because there's been a lack of that, and it's been taken up by other approaches, which is a real shame to see that we can't be critical of our own departments. And I think I'm perfectly open to have that sort of criticism there, and I think that engages with students as well. You know, we're not a perfect students' union by any means, and we've got to improve in every way that we can.
When you say that you think it's a good idea that these sort of magazines, the West 16 should be able to write what they want, what's the point in you reading through it then? What's the point in the editor-in-chief's job?
As I said before, it's sort of a legal aspect to it, and making sure that everything works as efficiently as it can do, and making sure that there's just nothing wrong, because you're a paid position, and you've got the wider interests of the student union to look after.
You need to make sure that the union isn't putting out stuff that would reflect badly on it.
Well, not necessarily. Well, in a sense, I mean, I'm not saying that, because, as I said before, I think if SUSU Media wants to be critical of SUSU, then it should be allowed to do so to an extent, making sure that all the facts are right and all the positions there, and that a right to reply is given. I think that's important.
Do you agree with that then, John? Do you think that you should be able to be critical, or that these societies should be able to be critical of the union?
Absolutely. I think that the inability of media to be critical of itself and of its large organisation, it just becomes an arm of propaganda almost in that sort of sense. If you control everything that goes through with a tight grip, iron fist, then you lose a lot of the more interesting and more interesting viewpoints that you might come up. If people are worried about being censored, essentially, then that can't be there. You can't have that.
It's something that's happened in the past before. SUSU Media. I think SUSU Media has learned from that mistake, and I think the DCI role it does really depend on what kind of DCI you're going to get. And I would have I've worked with media departments for a long time. I've been through all four of them, and I understand sort of the impact of having someone who's too controlling, and I don't think it's actually needed or required to be too controlling, but you do have to have someone there as that sort of last buck at the very top to sort of stop it, which is exactly why there should be an editor-in-chief. And you earlier said that there shouldn't be, so it sounds like you've completely reversed.
I got confused between editor and editor-in-chief in that.
Which is quite a key distinction to be making when you're going to be running for Vice President of Democracy and Creative Industries, getting confused between editor and editor-in-chief.
We all make mistakes.
We all make mistakes.
Moving on to the next question. Would you implement policy that you yourself may not agree with? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely, I would. I mean,
you would?
Because policy comes from student groups, and it comes all the way through, and it comes through representatives. And you are one voice. Yes, you're an influential voice as a sabbatical, but it's not up to you to suddenly transform decisions. You have to, give your weight to it, and perhaps you have facts that the other groups don't have, and you need to sort of give that opinion in, which may sway decisions. But I don't think you should outright go, no, we're not going to do this, unless there is some sort of legal or financial thing that it just simply can't be done.
So you're saying there that if you didn't agree with a policy, you would go and make sure that group knew all the facts before you would consider implementing it, or
no, I just make sure that
their mind, or
well, no, it depends. I mean, I'm not gonna force them to change their mind, and I think that in many cases you are there to sort of help
the informative process.
Yeah, you're there to sort of help with the wider process of what they want to do. Student leaders and so on, they want to do things, they want to be able to make changes, and it's your job to facilitate those changes. And whether you personally disagree on it is not I don't think, the particular issue at hand. I think you've got to make sure that these actions are done.
Okay.
The question again? Sorry,
would you implement policy you didn't agree with?
It would massively depend on the policy itself and the impact it would have on the union. I think that if it was something I heavily disagreed with, I would implement it in the initial instance, but I'd also look into why it had been implemented. So
but then that's slightly regressive, isn't it?
Isn't that something to do before?
What's the point in implementing something you disagree with just to then try and maybe later get rid of it?
It depends on the policy. It's such a broad question, and you can't really ask. I mean,
but what you said is that if there's a policy you don't really like, you would implement it and then look into it. Wouldn't it be better to do it the other way round?
Yes. It would, but some policies would, by definition, have to come into effect immediately.
Well, what kind of policies do you think should be instant, so to speak? I mean, what needs to
I
come?
don't know what sort of policies we're talking about here in the first instance.
Well, obviously there's a lot of different policies. I mean, ranging from student groups to athletic unions to media to structural reviews. What kind of things seem instant to you?
Anything regarding union stance on an outside matter, for example, would be something that would come into effect immediately.
So you're sort of taking a stance on sort of,
let's
tuition fees, for example.
Let's say, tuition fees. And if there was no time to sort of, let's take tuition fees as an example of this policy. So let's say the policy is that
union believes that we should oppose the £9,000 fees or something like that.
Yeah, obviously I agree with that. But say I didn't, I'd implement it. But I'd also, look into why I haven't implemented. I'd look into the arguments behind it, and if I could be convinced.
Well, if there was going to be a vote on it, I would hope that people are doing it and they're they're weighing up the pros and the cons. There's almost certainly going to be someone in favour of it, and there's almost certainly going to be a denial, and you should be there as the democracy and creative industries person. You'll be able to make your. I should hope you'll be able to make.
Of course, I'd implement it in the first instance.
Yeah. But then you'd want to look at it at a later date.
I want to look at it at a later date. I think there's always space for review.
I think that's always the same with policy. Any policy always needs to be looked at and seen whether it's relevant, and that happens a lot. And they come up every 5 years to be. Some of them come up every 5 years to be looked at.
So, David, would you work towards then trying to inform students in a way that you got the policies you wanted?
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, would you try and work with students or tell students sort of how you felt about policy to make sure that they wanted the kind of policies that you wanted to implement? Manipulation in such respect?
No, not really. I think students, let's go on to the example of voting. I think students should vote for what they believe in and what they think is right. And I would simply offer up my opinions or my discussions on certain matters. Just because sometimes as a sabbatical, as I said before, you've got a higher access to sort of information. You've got university relations and communications and marketing that you do and that kind of stuff. And I think that sometimes you've got the opinion that you have to provide to other people.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, guys. I hope that's helped you at home. If you just very, very quickly want to say who you are again and why they should vote for you at home.
I'm David Martin, I'm a third year geographer, and I think you should vote for me because I'm experienced, I'm passionate, I'm organised, and I'm going to give a fresh approach to this union.
Thank you very much, David. John?
I'm John North, and I'm voting for this. I'm also running for this role. I think you should vote for me because I'm for equality, I'm for accountability, and I'm for responsibility.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that, guys. I hope that's helped you at home. Join us again some other time, and thanks again.